All right, well, welcome. I'm Larry Tranel, dairy field specialist with Iowa State University Extension, Northeast and Southeast Iowa. Been in the position for about 31 years. And today we're going to talk about, first of all, the economics of milking frequency, and we'll also throw in some thought processes about once-a-day milking and just grass milk and things like that, too, to kind of get a feel for a couple things about thinking outside the box. So once-a-day milking, yeah, we're milking about every 24 hours, which is kind of a new concept, I think, to a lot of dairy farmers. Like, why would people want to do that? The 2X milking, most people are accustomed to, where you're doing about every 10 to 14 hours, depending on your schedule of the day. 3X milking every 8 hours. Our robots are milking anywhere from, let's say, 1.7 up to even 6 times a day. It really depends on the setting and their lactation. 4X and 6X milking, sometimes we get those on fresh cows. We've got other farmers that are milking 3 times in 2 days. So every 16 to 18 hours, those cows are getting milked. And we've got a couple of farmers I've worked with over the years that are doing 5X in 2 days. So they're doing about every 10 hours. And then also, in addition to that, we've got some low grain levels or some no grain or grass-fed, grass milk type farms. And we'll talk about those a little bit as well. So in New Zealand, we're first of all going to go where some of this research has actually taken place, Ireland as well, and Australia. But in the Jersey herds, once-a-day milking, as expected, resulted in decreased milk solids yield per cow and per hectare, 22% and 9% respectively. And so we do see that reduction. If we're looking at the black and whites, the Friesians, that corresponding decrease was about 31% and 19% per hectare. So we definitely realize that there's significant higher protein and milk solid concentrations, lower lactose concentrations, but again, we are losing milk solids in total. So the somatic cell count significantly increased by the once-a-day milking, as would be expected as well. And I think the reduction in milk solid yield, okay, we realize that it's smaller for the Jerseys than it is for the black and whites, the Friesians, indicating that the Jersey cows perhaps better suited for the once-a-day milking. And that's what I tend to see as I travel around the country, that we tend to see it more on Jersey herds that are trying to do it. So heading to Victoria, Australia, when we take a look at the profit and the return, rate of return is similar to twice-a-day milking for once-a-day milking. If the decrease in milk protein plus fat production as a result is less than 12%. So they kind of use that as a benchmark. If you experience more than a 12% loss, your profits and rate of return are probably going to go down. But if you can keep it below that, they'll probably be pretty similar. So when we take a look at herds here in the United States that have done the once-a-day milking, what they tend to find is that there's a lot of variability amongst the cows, even within the herd. Okay, so genetics plays a big part, where some don't really seem like they decrease that much, and others kind of dry themselves off and don't continue to milk very well at all. So the decrease is likely to be greater than that in most instances, more than 12%, because sometimes you're 25, 30%. Okay, so resulting in decreased profit if we choose to do that. So back to New Zealand, cows milk once a day produced anywhere from 10 to 28% less milk and milk solids in the early to mid lactation, 9 to 13% less than late lactation than the twice a day milking cows. And so what do we learn from that is that we tend to take a look that late lactation might be an opportunity for herds that might be a little bit more seasonal to work with, maybe go once a day milking for the last month before the whole herd gets dried off if they're somewhat seasonal. So the last losses in fat and protein yield were slightly lower than for those of milk. Okay, so when you take a look at the reasons why people are starting to really consider this once a day milking, there's definitely a big issue with labor, suitability of it, and sometimes as they increase herd size, they can't find the labor. But again, that labor and just the changing lifestyle expectations, and I think of a couple of farms that I know of that did it, it was a lifestyle type thing. And yeah, they realized they reduced some profit, but they were still able to milk cows and still have the lifestyle more so what they wanted. So we take a look at both once a day milking and or grass milk. I just want to work with just a little bit here of this spreadsheet. So we had a farmer from Iowa that asked the question one time, what are all the variables that come into play if I'm going to consider changing my milking frequency to once a day milking, or for me to go to grass milk, or to do both? And so we tried to put together a spreadsheet. My son, who's an organic dairy farmer, Josh Tranel, actually assisted with me with the spreadsheet. And once we got it put together, he actually used it not to go to once a day, but to determine whether or not they should take part of their herd and actually go to 3 times a day, even though most of them were 2 times a day. So basically, when you see the blue fonts with the gray background, those are inputs. Okay, so we're looking at herd size, what their milk price is, and the ones that we're working with here were actually organic, and they were getting a grass milk premium of about $5 per hundredweight to sell the grass milk where the cursor is here. So to do it, you also need to know the price per pound of your fat, protein, and other solids, and what the percentage of those actually are here. The pounds of milk per cow per day. And if you're going once a day, what's the predicted energy corrected milk loss that you're going to see from that. And then we'll take a look at basically the projected changes in milk fat, protein, which will be a little bit different for each of those categories, and milk solids with it as well. And so with those inputs, we can take a look at what's happening within the herd, the changes of, like we're here, just changes in pounds per cow. So as we take a look at one of the biggest things that's going to change besides milk production is actually your feed costs. And so in this example, we have our cow weight, we have the current pounds of grain supplement as fed, and basically taking a look at if you're feeding corn silage, we'll count that about half, because your corn silage is usually about half grain, ranging 40 to 60%, but usually about half grain and half stalk. When we feed less grain or more grain, okay, there's a forage displacement rate. So if you feed an extra pound of corn, you're only going to displace probably a third of a pound of forage. So when you take a look at those displacement rates, it's kind of important for us to see what that expected grain to forage displacement rate would actually be. So when we take a look at cost per pound of dry matter on the ration, I think this is big as well. Before we make the change and after we make the change, because we definitely can feed a lot cheaper ration when you're doing all forage with very little grain going into it as well. So there's labor changes that happen. And so you're milking once a day versus twice a day. What are those labor rates and the cost of that labor? Cull rates tend to go down as we work with that. And also we're only running that milking system once a day versus twice. So your repairs and your electricity, water, TTIP, some of those things go into it and increase. Somatic cell count, as we mentioned in the research, will tend to go up. And so here we're expecting it to actually go up. So when we take a look at all those variables on the economics of once a day or grass milk, we just could basically taking all those variables and putting into a partial budget of the changes of income. So our milk production went way down. So that's a change in income. Fat, protein, other solids actually would go up. The milk premiums would go down because the somatic cell count's going up. We do have a premium for grass milk. A lot of savings in labor that sometimes people don't always think about, which is a pretty important piece of it, along with repair costs. You can see the feed costs, but the total changes in expenses of negative 87,000 versus the changes in income of negative 89,000. So that net financial impact can actually, and this is with the labor savings as well, that net financial impact can actually be positive this is more of a grass milk versus a milking frequency. But again, I tend to carry the perception that if you have jerseys and you really truly want to go once a day milking, then I would highly consider maybe going grass milk, or if you're grass milk already, you're already losing some of that production because of that. How much more can you lose or will you lose if you actually take two things and actually marry those two together? So that's just kind of a quick thought process on the economics of once a day milking, and some thoughts, just trying to think outside the box with some goals that some dairy producers might have. The second one is when we take a look at a lot of the cover crops and different types of feed sources with grazing heifers, I tend to carry the premise that I think everybody should be grazing heifers. And when I look around the country or drive around the country, or if I see the White House or whatever, I'm basically saying there's a lot of grass that's going to waste around this country that could be utilized for grazing. So we take a look at economical feed sources. So again, the grazing, the cover crops, byproducts, and I'm going to focus on the grazing. The cover crops were already discussed in a previous session by Josh Tranel. So when we take a look at the cost of raising heifers by grazing, this is just a slide that I like to show about just the whole thought process. When we take a look at especially these bigger animals that are already in their breeding ages, even with 150-day grazing period, based on feed and labor and a lot of the other costs that go into it, we can actually save some pretty good costs compared to confinement type operations with them. So we take a look at the 200 days of grazing, and if we can save $1.50 a day we can actually get some pretty sizable differences of heifers on pasture here. So when we take a look at the possibility of how many heifers that we're actually raising in a herd, this can actually get quite significant, but I think the number boils down that we might be able to save 12 to 25 or 20% of our heifer raising costs solely by going grazing. And so I realize there's a lot more management that goes into it, fencing, watering, things about heifers getting out, who's going to manage different types of things. But I think there's a lot of benefit for us to still consider as a dairy industry that I think there should be more heifers out there on pasture. So when we take a look at supplemental guides, and I used to be a dairy heifer raiser myself, when you start taking a look at, beyond breeding age, as long as you get some pretty good pastures out there and that 45% NDF type pastures, I mean, there's very little to any supplementation. So we can actually simplify the management, I think, of feeding the heifers as well, not just the cost, but the management can actually reduce as well. When we take a look at health benefits of the grazed heifers and whether they're rotationally grazed or continuously grazed in the left two columns, the feedlot ones on the right side, you just take a look at things like DAs and difficulty calving, metritis, ketosis, skeletal injury, which didn't change much, but there definitely are some health benefits to rotationally grazed animals as well. So this is a study a friend of mine, Faye Benson in Cornell, and it's a few years old now, but when you take a look at grazing versus confinement and the animals being treated versus not, and also calving ease are two other health benefits that sometimes I don't think we take enough time to truly understand what's going on with the health benefits of grazing. And then so we also have not just the cost or the health benefits, but there's also a milk production phase that actually comes in here. So the pasture-raised heifers at 25,328 here versus the confinement-raised heifers at 23,000. So definitely a milk production difference of those heifers in first lactation when they come into the herd as well. So when we take a look at per acre returns, and again, I used to be a heifer raiser and a grazer, and when we take a look at that value of gain, I used to be able to almost get $1.50 per pound of gain. Now it's probably more like $1. It might even be a little bit less than that. When we still take a look at the costs that go into it, the return to labor and management per acre can actually be pretty competitive. Of course, it all depends what corn prices are or other alternative type crops with that, but it can definitely be a very competitive thought. And when you take a look at the picture on the left, people always have this mindset that, well, I don't have any poor ground that I can put into grass pasture. Okay, and I always take the thought process that I would put them on my best soils. So when you take a look at even your Tama-Silt loam soils and putting pasture on that might be heavy grass, it might be some kind of a cocktail mix, it might be alfalfa, other type of legume grass mix. But you can work with a lot of different types of mixtures, a lot of different types of pastures. But the key is, like this cow is getting, it's got to be good quality, and it's also got to be great quantity because they're only going to take so many bites per day. But for people that can truly manage and have the land available to work with pasture management, we can still get some good dry matter intakes off that in addition to good dry matter production. So I tend to say that pasture can actually compete quite well with most other crop enterprises. Corn silage is probably the toughest one to compete with, but I think it can definitely be very competitive, and for certain operations can actually be a very good one. So with that, we'll just kind of leave it there for questions. And again, thanks for listening for this session.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions here, Larry. If we start out with when pasturing heifers, you have some cost you might not have identified, insect tags, pink eye vaccine, and not as good a rate of gain. You care to comment on those?
Yeah, I would definitely say that there are some added costs as you look at pastures. I mean, there are definitely some costs that we save as well as you take a look at the balance with them. When they took a look at the rate of gain, I think one of the things is that if we can try to get 1.7 and 1.8, and I was able to actually get 1.8 without any grain, the only supplement that they would get was kind of a mineral mix or something to try to help reduce bloat. So I think those gains are kind of definitely in the ballpark with them. And yes, maybe they're not quite as high, but if I would actually push them for, some additional supplemental, especially in energy or some, because there's plenty of protein in there, I think we can compare quite well with that. But I definitely would agree that there are some added things and management-wise because of just weather-related type things, but you do have some parasite type issues with them on pasture as well. So definitely a point well taken.
Okay, going to once a day milking, I think you identified that there are some breed differences, but what about crossbreds? How do they fit into that?
I think they would actually mix in quite well. So from what I've experienced, for the most part, is our Holsteins the black and whites tend to be the worst at it. Our Jerseys probably tend to be the best. We've had at least some experience with both crossbreds and brown Swiss. And I think, whatever breed we're working with, the hard part is the variability, even within the breed itself, because we've seen some Holsteins that actually adapted halfway decent to it. But I think there are some breed differences where our Jerseys are probably going to be the best. But I think when we take a look at that variability, we've seen some that, probably dropped 35 to 50%. And we've seen some that only dropped 10 or 12% in all different stages of lactation. And so again, as people try to build their herds, can they find those animals that don't drop quite that much? And, how do you try to find the genetics besides testing them out and raising them and seeing how they go? Because you're not going to be able to breed for it.
Okay. Now we're going to kind of slip back to the cover crops. Uh, Question is, have you seen better yields with sorghum Sudan grass after rye rather than seeding a short day corn for silage, talking June 1st planting dates?
With that, I won't say I'm going to have a lot of experience with it, but from what I know in working with producers, that if we're in areas that tend to have drier weather, so let's say in southern Iowa, where we tend to have some drier soils, drier weather sometimes, there I would actually tend to probably give more of a favor to the sorghum Sudan grass. If we're in what I call corn silage country around the Dubuque, Iowa area here, we've got some very good soils in the Delaware County and across a lot of northeast Iowa. I guess I would probably give the favor to following it with the corn silage. So it really depends, I think, on your soil quality and the moisture and your ability to manage both.
Okay, the last question we have up is have you seen or tried any brassicas in your cocktail mix?
Yeah, there definitely are some, and even though Josh couldn't be with us for the Q&A, he's actually trying to. He's been asked to actually give us a list of what's actually in that cocktail mix, and I know he uses it. I've got some other producers in Iowa, even some pretty high production average producers that use it for some dry cow feed and things like that. So I'll try to get the mix and I'll try to get it into the chat box.
Okay. Other than an inquiry of where the pizza and milk is, I think we are have answered all the questions at this point.
So next we'll move into a presentation on mindset tactics and behavioral and brain health.